Yeah. Okay, great. Okay. What I want to do is we'll see if we can do this. We're gonna, yesterday in the Kriyat Torah, the parsha ended with the Amalek attacking the Jewish people, and it ends with a rather cryptic reference here. I want to just review it, remind everybody of it, and very interesting Rashi there based upon a midrash. Vayomer Hashem Moshe Ketov Zot Zikaron B'Sefer. So Hashem said to Moshe, write this as a remembrance in a book. V'sim bo'oznei Yehoshua, and place it in the ears of Yehoshua. Ki macho emche et zecher Amalek mitachat hashemayim. I will surely blot out any remembrance of Amalek from underneath the heavens. Vayiven Moshe mizbeach, and Moshe built an altar. Vayikra shmo Hashem Nisi, and he called it Hashem Nisi. Hashem is my banner. Hashem is my miracle. Whatever, all kinds of different translations. Vayomer, and he said, Ki yad al kes yah vilchama laHashem b'Amalek v'dor dor. For the hand is on the throne of God, a war against Amalek from every generation, from generation to generation. Let's take a look at how Rashi interprets this last phrase there, where it's this cryptic reference that the hand is on the throne of God, a war against Amalek from generation to generation. So Rashi there quotes from our sages, Yado shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu hurma lishava b'kiso. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is raising his hand. So, like we go to a court and you swear on the Bible, HaKadosh Baruch Hu swears on his throne. Liot lo milchama, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to wage war. The Eva, there's going to be eternal hostility from God, Amalek, Olamit, against Amalek forever. Umahu case, v'lo ne'amar kisei. Now, really interesting comment here. In the verse in the Torah, which describes the throne of the Lord, it says case. That's not the normal way we say throne. We say kisei. Okay? Kisei. Why did it say case? V'lo ne'amar kisei. V'af Hashem nechlak lechetzio. And also God's name. When it says kiyad al kes yah, for the hand of God is upon the throne of the Lord, it only spells half the name of throne, case instead of kisei, and it says yud hey instead of yud hey vav hey, only half of God's name. So why is half a throne and half of God's name? So Rashi explains, Nishbach Kadosh Baruch Hu shein shmo shalem vein kiso shalem ad sheyimachesh shmo shel Amalek kulo. Kadosh Baruch Hu took an oath that his name will not be complete and his throne will not be complete until the name of Amalek is eradicated entirely. And when Amalek is wiped out, then God's name will be complete, and God's throne will be complete. And then this Chazal, which Rashi quotes, brings a proof text of this. So the quotes a pasuk which describes this ultimate war against Amalek. It's an allusion to this battle against Amalek. And then he quotes from Amos. Va'arim natashta avad zichram hema. Mahu omer acharav Hashem le'olam yeshev harei Hashem shalem. Konein lemishpat kiso harei kiso shalem. It quotes a pasuk which is describing the aftermath of the ultimate eradication of Amalek, the ultimate eradication of evil. And it says there two interesting phrases that are important for our purposes. So it says, Hashem le'olam yeshev, after this ultimate victory against Amalek, Hashem le'olam yeshev, the Lord will dwell forever, and it uses the full name of God, Hashem le'olam yeshev, spelled in the pasuk Yud Hey Vav Hey, and Konein lemishpat kiso, that Hashem will prepare his throne of judgment. And there the word throne of judgment, kiso, is spelled full, kaf samech. Aleph. So Hareki so Shalem. So this is the interesting proof text that when Amalek is ultimately vanquished, God's name will not be just Yud Hey, but Yud Hey Vav Hey, and his throne will not be Kaf Samach, but Kaf Samach Aleph. Instead of case, he say, fine. Now, just store that for a moment. Though I want to pose a question. What does it mean to say that Hashem's Kisei will not be complete and his name will not be complete as long as Amalek is in the world, as long as the evil is in the world? I think the idea is obvious. As long as there are forces in the world which oppose goodness, which oppose God, then God's Malchut, the throne, is symbolic of God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty is incomplete as long as there are aspects of the human race that refuse to be subservient to God's will. So a king that nobody pays attention to, a king whose authority is not absolute, is not a full king. So God's malchut, his kingship, will only be complete. His name, his reputation, the essence of what God is, that is, Ribono Shel Olam, sovereign in the universe, will not be complete until Amalek is eradicated. So only then will be thrown Kaf Samach Aleph, his sovereignty in his fullness, and his name, God's essence, his reputation, will only be full Yud Hey Vav Hey at that point. Fine. Store that aside for a second. And what I want to do is make a very sharp segue to something which may seem totally irrelevant to what we just discussed. But you're going to see at the end how it's all going to tie in. I want to discuss what perhaps is the one of the most famous parts of our tefillah. As you know, before we begin the main course of tefillah, the main course of tefillah in the morning is the Shema and the Shemona Esrei. That's the main course of the meal. But we have an hors d'oeuvre. The hors d'oeuvre, as it were, is the Psuke de Zimra, which is essentially a collection of psalms. There's some other things added as well, but it's essentially a collection of psalms. And we're doing this, we're sort of warming up to the main part of tefillah, which is the recitation of the Shema and the Amidah and Shemona Esrei. And everybody here is familiar with the part of the Psuke de Zimra that is most famous, what we call Ashrai. We'll discuss in a second why it's called Ashrai, though it really just begins with Tila David. Okay, so I want to show you something interesting halacha. Let's learn some halacha. Shulchan Aruch. Im od ein shehut lo yomar rak baruch she'amar util David v'yishtabach. I know that nobody here ever comes to shul late. All tzaddikim come. As a matter of fact, you come early to get in the mood. So what happens if something happened? You weren't feeling so well that day. You rush off to shul. You get there late. And you want to be able to keep up with the congregation for when they say the Shema and the Shemona Esrei. But they're already well deep into Psuke de Zimra, and you'll never be able to catch up if you say all Psuke de Zimra. What's the halacha? So the Shulchan Aruch says that if you can't catch up by davening fast, just say the skeletal outline of Psuke de Zimra. What's that skeletal outline? Baruch She'amar, which is the blessing that begins the Psuke de Zimra. Ashrai, or Tila de David, same thing, right? A reference to that one particular psalm. And Yishtabach, which is the blessing which ends Psuke de Zimra. So that's the, if you're pressed for time, that's a good shortcut. Baruch She'amar, Ashrai, Yishtabach. Okay. Now, the question is why? Why is that good enough? So there's a commentary on Orach Chaim, the part of Shulchan Aruch which deals with daily laws and the holidays, called the Ateret Tzvi, and he explains it. He says something pretty amazing. Tila David. Lefi she'ikar psuke de Zimra nitkana bishvil oto mizmar. He says that in fact the psuke de Zimra was established for the purpose of the recitation of that particular psalm. It's not that we want to say psalms in order to warm up to the main course, the Shema and the Amidah, but the sages who formulated the Sidur created Psuke de Zimra in order that we would be able to recite that particular chapter of Tehillim, of Psalms. Why? Sha'omro muftach le'olam haba. Because whoever says that particular psalm is assured the world to come. Now we'll return to that in just a few moments. But that's an amazing idea, that Psuke de Zimra was made to make sure we say Ashrai. That's why if you're short for time, just say Ashrai, right? Say the beginning blessing, Baruch Shemar, the end blessing, Yishtabach, and in the middle, put the Ashrai. Because the whole purpose of Psuke de Zimra is to say Ashrai. Fine. Now, I want to just go back and briefly address a couple of sort of technical questions. And I believe you have another shiur that deals with tefillah, so it could be some of these issues were discussed more at length then. We're used to calling this, yes.
Well, if the whole purpose of Psuke de Zimra is say Ashray, why not just say Ashray? There's a heck of a lot of other stuff there. I mean, say it twice, say Ashray twice, or 3 times. It's sort of like, it's an odd idea to say all these verses for the purpose of what could just be said by itself.
Yeah, okay, so it's a very good question. And I think the answer is by asking a similar question. I mentioned before that the main course of Shacharit is the recitation of the Shema and Shemona Esrei. I think that there's no question about that. Yet, it's interesting that if, based upon that, Bruce would say, if that's true, just say Shema and the Shemona Esrei. But we don't do that. We have 2 blessings before the Shema. We have a blessing after the Shema. And then we say the Amidah. Do you notice it's the same type of thing, that we have the purpose, which is Shema, but we bookend it, we have these bookends in the beginning and at the end of blessings. So the purpose for blessings is the notion of framing something, to give it meaning. What am I doing here?
That was one is a minute, the other's 15 minutes. It's sort of a...
I know you're a busy man, Bruce. So the truth of the matter is, we're trying to give a context, a framework of meaning. And in addition, there's a notion of warming up before you say that which is the essential part. Is a need, there's a need to be able to get in the right mood. So Chazal apparently thought that you had a lot of free time and provided these bookends and warming up to the Shema, up to the Ashray, and sort of warming down, etc. So it's really to create a certain kind of mood. We'd have to really discuss in detail the structure of Psuke de Zimra and appreciate more, which I want to do right now, how each of the added elements contributes to the themes that are in the Ashray itself. But the bottom line is, for our purposes today, that the real purpose of Psuke de Zimra is contained in the Ashray, and everything else is in order to make that more meaningful. Okay, fine. So I just want to briefly address the fact that we're used to calling it Ashray, but that's not what the Talmud calls it. And it's not accurate whatsoever. So what's Ashray? It's a psalm, Mizmor Kuf Mem Hey. It's the 145th psalm. And it begins Tila David, Armim Kachash Elokai Hamelech. Fine. The only problem is that that's not Ashray, because we add 2 psukim before the Ashray, and we add also after the Ashray another pasuk, and those psukim are from different Tehillim. Why are they added? So I just want to show you interesting comment here from the most important work, if you want to understand tefillah, the Abu Darham, or Abu Draham, some people pronounce it Abu Darham, who was wrote this extremely important work on the Siddur, 14th century Spain. And he addresses this issue. He says the following: why we have these verses that are added at the beginning? It's really Tilal David. That's the beginning of Ashrai. Why Ashrai? Why those two verses at the beginning? He says, anu lemedim beperek ein omdim shezarich adam sheyishaheh sha'a achat kodem sheyitpalel kadei shetit da'ato alav v'yachaven et libo. It's really addressing your question, Bruce. He quotes from the Gemara. The Gemara says, when you daven, don't just go from what you were doing right before davening. You're doing chiropractic treatment. Oh, it's mincha. Jump into Shemona Esrei. No. Take a deep breath. Abu Darham says, get into the right frame of mind so you can focus. So this actually accentuates how central the Ashray is, that don't just jump into it. They added two verses that come from other Psalms in order that you can warm up to this central Psalm, which is the 145th Psalm, which begins Tilal David. So the two extra psukim in the beginning are in order to get into the proper frame of mind. So this theme of getting to the proper frame of mind repeats itself over again. The whole psukim in Zimmer really is to get the proper frame of mind for the Shema and the Amidah. The whole purpose of Psukim de Zimra is to say Ashray. Why do we put verses, those two Ashrays, in the beginning of Ashray, or Tilal David, I'll call it, in order to warm up to the Tilal David itself? So they're warming up to the warming up to the warming up. And then he goes on. What about at the end? What do we need those extra psukim at the end? That's not from Tilal David, 140th Psalm. What's it doing there? He says, "V'zo me'ata v'ad olam." It's to. I'm sorry, I skipped the line there. Lahodia shu ben olam haba. It's to tell you, to remind you that if you say this, it's an amazing thing. You're going to get to olam haba. How? Because that verse, "V'anachnu nevarech Yah," and we will bless the Lord, me'ata v'ad olam, forever. Me'ata v'ad olam, right? That phrase, from now and forever, is a reminder of the reward for saying this, that we're going to get olam haba. We're going to be able to achieve eternity. So the Abu Darham explains the meaning of adding two psukim at the beginning to warm up, and at the end to remind us of the eternal reward for saying this properly. Okay. Now, let's take a look at a very famous Gemara. Amarav Elazar, Amarabi Avina. Kol homer tilal David b'chol yom shalosh pamim muftach lo shehu ben olam haba. Anybody who recites Tilal David 3 times is assured olam haba. Wow, that's cool. My Tama, what's the reason? So if you say it's because it has this special quality that it's an acrostic, every verse in Tilal David begins with a successive letter of the alphabet. I'm sure everybody knows that. So the Gemara says, if that's the special quality of Tilal David, I can think of a better psalm to be said. Nema Ashrei Tamime Darach. Say this verse, or this psalm, Ashrei Tamime Darach, which is Psalm 119. That'd be better to say if this unique quality of Ashrei was that it was an acrostic. Why? Because that chapter 119 has the same acrostic successive verses, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, etc. But each letter of the alphabet is repeated 8 times. So 8 verses that Aleph, 8 verses with Bet, 8 verses with Gimel, etc. So wouldn't that be better to say, if that's what's so special about Ashrei? Ela mishum di'it bei potechet yedecha. So the Gemara says, oh, that's true. If it was only the poetic structure, indeed, 119th Psalm would be better than the 145th Psalm. But this has an extra element. Hang on a second. Why? It has the notion of potechet yedecha v'asvilach ha'son. Hashem, you open your hand and you supply the needs of all. That theme is what pushes this psalm over into its unique status. So just let me just finish the paragraph, Bruce, and we'll get to you. So the Gemara says, wait a second. If that's what's so unique about this psalm, that it describes God as the source of supplying all of our needs, Nema Halel Hagadol. I can think of a better psalm for that. Psalm 136. It says there, God gives sustenance, bread, sustenance, l'chol basar, for all flesh. So why don't we say that psalm instead of the 145th? Say the 136th, called the Halal Gadol. Ela mishum d'it beitarte. You know why we say Tila David? It's because it has both qualities. It has this poetic structure of Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, plus the central theme that HaKadosh Baruch Hu supplies all of our needs. Yes, there was a question.
Well, just to point out that the Ashray we say today doesn't have the, as you know, the letter Nun in the pasuk, so it's not exactly the full alphabet. It's close. Whether that's
mine has a Nun in it.
I thought the sentence with the
That's
Nun.
Weird. I think you should return your Siddur. It was a misprint. I'm just joking with you. We'll discuss that. Okay. So now
I have a question to ask.
Sure.
Question one is a statement. The question is, in the time of the base of Mikdash, didn't say any type of sources. They went to the base of Mikdash and they said,
I'm sorry, Erwin. The internet connection is unstable. I can't hear. I hear every fourth word. I apologize. If you'd be in touch with me privately, I'd be happy to answer your question. But I can't hear what you're saying. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you're
I'm sorry.
fine.
Yeah, I apologize, Erwin. There's something wrong with the internet. Okay. Now, I just want to point out before we dive into this, one of my pet peeves is, and we're going to talk about this, I'm working on a big project, which I'm going to share with you very soon, trying to decipher the 4 most cryptic verses in the entire Torah about the sons of God mating with the daughters of man, if you know what I'm talking about, right before the flood story. Almost all commentators say that those are the 4 most cryptic, difficult psukim in the entire Torah, and we're going to try to deal with that, but that's coming up. One of my pet peeves is when we have sort of a mechanistic understanding of reward and punishment. Whoever says these following words, this incantation, Amil Teket Olam Haba. And this theme repeats itself over and over again. A mezuzah, put this cloth on your door, your house is guarded. There's a fire in your house, God forbid. Oh, there's a letter missing in your mezuzah. Have your mezuzahs checked. I can't stand it. You'll forgive me. I hope I don't lose my place in the world to come for this. But it seems to me this is very close to Avodah Zarah, to idolatry, some kind of mechanistic behavior an incantation or some other kind of behavior, like putting a cloth on your, and voodoo. It's somehow world to come, your house is guarded, etc.
Even kissing the mezuzah.
You'll never see me kissing the mezuzah. Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to post this YouTube on the. I have to think about it. So I want to show you an important comment. This is Rabbeinu Bachya, right? This is Rabbeinu Bachya on the Torah, right? Not the Cholot Holovot, Rabbeinu Bachya. He quotes the Gemara. Anybody who says Tilal David, meal tickets the world to come. Akavana ki mitoch shivbonein b'meh sheyoru hapsukim ve'el ma sheyirmazu az yakir v'yavchi niflaot tamim deim v'yitchazek libo b'nuat Hashem barach v'avodato u'bazeh yirash chayil haba. This is the following. It's not by reciting it 3 times a day, you instant world to come. No. He says that by contemplating the message of the psukim, that person will recognize and discern the wonders of God. They'll become strengthened in their faith in God and their determination to serve God. And through this, they'll inherit the world to come. This is so critical. It's not the recitation of words that magically take you to Olam Haba. It's if we internalize the message, are inspired by that message, and it impacts our behavior. And through that behavior, Be'ezrat Hashem, we will get the world to come. So this is a very important point all along. And same thing with the mezuzah, right? It's not the mezuzah that protects your house. It's internalizing the message of the mezuzah, and so on and so forth. Fine. Okay, now I want to return back to our passage here, where the Gemara said that if we recite this 3 times, that we're assured the world to come. By the way, we're going to recite it 3 times. So we recited Shachar, we recited twice in Psukei de Zimra, which is made just for Ashrai, that we saw. And after the Shemona Esrei, we say Ashrai again. And then before Mincha, we say Ashrai the 3rd time. Okay. So the Gemara wants to know what's so special about it. So the first thing was, well, look at this great poetry that the poet used the successive letters of the alphabet. Who cares? What's so great about that? So I want to show you how the different commentators understood what's so special about the acrostic form.
We also have to wonder why they're an edited Marav if it's that great. You know, what the heck? To add it in Marav time would just be an added bonus. I mean, we should go for it.
I couldn't hear you, Bruce. I'm sorry.
They do think if it's that amazing, I mean, Olam Haba is a big deal. So add it in Marav.
The last 3 words I didn't hear.
Add Ashray at Marav.
Oh.
Like, why not? I mean, it's such
that's
a
a good question.
powerful...
Yeah, a very good question. Hang on, Forsham actually asked that question. So take a look at the, again, we're going to look at the Abu Darham. So he quotes the Gemara, maybe it's because it has an aleph bet, that's why it has such power. Perush. He says the following. What's so special about using the aleph bet? Because the aleph bet represents all the different consonantal sounds you could possibly make, right? And so therefore, it's the notion of praising God with the totality of our being, a total commitment to God. And so that's what's so magical about the using the aleph bet form. Okay, now it is missing a letter, the nun, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, there are other approaches to understanding what's so special about aleph bet. So look at what Pnei Yoshua says. Shekolo olam kulo lo nivra el letzavot lezeh lemisho sik b'torah shenitna al yedei kafet otiyot aleph bet sheyesh bazeh hamizmor. He says the following: using all the letters of the alphabet represents something else. In addition to the fact that it represents the total sounds we can make, it also represents Torah. Torah is God's will is expressed through the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So by using all the letters of the Hebrew alphabet except for Nun, which we'll talk about in a minute, so therefore it expresses this notion of Torah, that by being inspired to learning Torah, that is our meal ticket to Olam Haba. Now, I want to go back and deal with this issue of the missing Nun. So the Gemara, after it says that perhaps what's unique about it is the alphabet, but there's a paraktilim which is even better at the alphabet because it repeats each one 8 times. And then maybe what's unique about it is the fact that it expresses the notion that God is the source of all of our needs, supplying all of our needs. There might have been a parak of Tehillim that's even better at that, but this has both qualities. So now the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Bipnei ma lo ne'emar nun ba'ashrei. There's a problem. Letter Nun is not there. Now, I just want to share something interesting about that. Gemara points out something obvious. All the letters are used except for Nun. So, look at number 10 here. It happened to be we found in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, parts of Tehillim. And guess what? The 145th Psalm was found. And guess what letter is not missing there? There's a Nun. It says the following. In that parak of Tehillim, it says, Ne'eman Elohim bidvarav, that God is faithful in his words, v'chasid b'chol ma'asav, and he is pious in his actions. He's righteous in his actions. That pasuk, which starts with a Nun, is in the version of the 145th Psalm found in Qumran. Well, I'll be a monkey's uncle. So when the Gemara asks what happened to the Nun, and to give an explanation, which we'll look at in a second, there is a Nun. It's just got lost in the version that we have, but we found the missing Nun in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, there's a lot of interesting things you could say about the significance of this discovery in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I want to share with you an interesting comment. There was a Professor David Flusser. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he is considered to be, I don't think he's alive anymore. He was one of the world's greatest experts of Second Temple period in Judaism, Jewish history. Also extremely interested in the origins of Christianity within Judaism. And he says the following, Raglaim ledavar she'ein zeh hapasuk hamekori shenishmat mu'achar yoter. So when this discovery was made, that we have a version of the 145th Psalm from Qumran, Dead Sea Scrolls, that has the Nun, he says there seems to be evidence that that pasuk that has the Nun, the missing mysterious Nun, it's not really the original pasuk. It's a forgery. I'm not sure forgery is the right word, but it's not original. Ki'im tosefet sheba'a lashlim et ha'alefet. It was an addition made later because people were troubled by the fact there's a missing Nun. So they said, oi, there's a missing Nun. We'll compose a verse that has the Nun in it in the beginning and put it in there. Now, what made Professor Flusser think that this may be a later edition, not the original version of the Psalm? He says that it's because if you look carefully at the entire Psalm, it always refers to God by the tetragrammaton, Yud Hey, Vav Hey. Now, for academics who are studying Tanakh, the uses of the different names of God is a very important clue as to original source, dating, etc. The whole psalm referring to God is Yud He Vav He. Pasuk ze oseh shimush b'shem Elohim dafka. Only this pasuk with the nun uses the name Elohim instead of Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. So he says he feels that generally documents from Tanakh are consistent in the use of how they refer to God, and it's purposeful. So the fact that the entire psalm uses only the name Elohim, only the name Yud He Vav He, and not Elohim, and only this verse has Elohim, it is suggested that it was put in later, and it is a kind of a later addition. I'm not sure forgery is the right word for it, but it's not the original psalm.
It also suggests they made a very simple mistake, so to speak. Like, it's so obvious. Why would they do that?
So put it this way, it's only obvious if you're someone who has lived in the era of post-Wellhausen and the other academic scholars who felt that the different uses of God's name are extremely critical in terms of tracing the source of these documents. It could be for if you lived 2,500 years ago and you were a member of one of these sects, say in the early Second Temple period, and living in the Dead Sea, right? Like, I'm not sure you would have felt it's as significant as modern scholars do. So you could argue with Professor Flusser, but I think that's an interesting point. Now, I'm going to tell you something about myself for a second. He was not a religious man. I mean, he might have been spiritual. I don't know much about Professor Flusser, but I actually, in my distorted thinking, that's what gives him credibility. Because if an Orthodox rabbi were to say, oh, the Gemara is wrong, there was a nun, we discovered it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Orthodox rabbi has too much of an axe to grind, right? He doesn't want the Gemara to not be aware that there was a nun, right? But it somehow got lost. But a professor at Hebrew University doesn't have that axe to grind. He's not there to defend the honor of the Talmud. So when Professor Flusser, right, says he thinks that based upon independent evidence, right, he doesn't bring the Talmud to prove his point. He says that based upon using certain principles, using contemporary methodology of biblical analysis, that this nun seems to be a forgery. So that's why I really appreciate it. I'm sorry?
If they used it for the Aleph Bet, then there probably was a nun involved.
I'm sorry?
If they used it as an Aleph Bet, if the reason why we're saying it's the Aleph Bet, then there must have been a nun there also.
Yeah, so that's why it's troubling. That's why it's troubling to the Talmud. Except for, we're going to see that the Talmud gives an answer. We'll see that in a second. And Professor Flusser says that he thinks, I mean, he doesn't say it right here, but the fact that the nun was never there, or at least the verse that's in Qumran is a forgery, he thinks is good evidence for that. That maybe the fact that there's not a nun there is purposeful. So let's take a look at how the Talmud explains why there's a missing nun. So we'll go back to the Talmud. The Talmud says the following. So how come there's no nun? So in the second paragraph here, so Rabbi Yochanan answers, it's because the nun is resonant, evocative of the falling down of the Jewish people. Now, by the way, if you're following the text here in the Gemara, it says the falling down of the enemies of Israel. The Talmud is sort of superstitious. It doesn't want to say the falling down of Israel. So it says the enemies of Israel, but it really means Israel. The nun is evocative of the falling down of the Jewish people. Dichtiv, and it quotes a pasuk, Nafla lo tosif kum betulat Yisrael. She has fallen. She shall not again arise, O virgin of Israel. So that if that nun, if it would have been there, it would have been evocative of the notion, like in this verse, that she has fallen. She will not again arise, O virgin of Israel. So therefore, the nun was left out because it represents symbolically the idea of falling. Now, at first glance, this is a very strange comment in the Gemara. There are a lot of words that begin with a nun. Why would it be necessarily so? If the nun would have been there, it would have been evocative of the Jewish people falling down. So it occurred to me something very interesting in terms of linguistics with regard to the Hebrew language. You may be aware that Hebrew words are composed, generally speaking, of three-letter roots. And we add prefixes to the three-letter root, we add suffixes to the three-letter root, or infixes, there's such a word, where we put a letter inside the root, and that gives different nuances of meaning to that three-letter root. So when you want to know what a word means, you look for the three-letter root. But there's one letter in the Hebrew alphabet which very, very frequently falls out. Nun. The letter nun. I'll give you an example. If I want to say, I am falling, I need no fail. Okay. What if I say I fell? I need nafalti. What if I want to say I will fall? Epol. Epol. Wait a second. What happened to the nun? The nun fell out. Epol, not enpol. The letter in the Hebrew alphabet, for linguistic reasons, that falls out more than any other letter is the word nafal, is the letter nun. And so it falls out. Now, isn't it interesting that the way you say fall in Hebrew is nafal, because of the nun? So the nun is incredibly resonant of the notion of falling. It's even evidenced by how it functions linguistically in Hebrew. It's a letter which falls out. It represents falling, not fall.
But you could fall into a treasure. Falling doesn't have to be negative.
That's interesting.
Well, it's not just the Qumran, also in the Sephardet, there's a verse for the nun.
Yeah. So it's the same answer there, right? The Hebrew word there for the Septuagint's in Greek, so it's a little hard to discern.
Yeah, the sentence translates roughly to the Lord is faithful in his word and holy in all his works.
Yeah, which is more or less like, it's very close to what's in Qumran, but that shouldn't bother us because whichever text was being used by Qumran, it was also used perhaps by the Septuagint or vice versa. It's hard to know which came first. They're in the same school of thought and would suffer from the same deficiency of using apparently in the Septuagint, it's not clear exactly what the Hebrew text was because you can't tell. It's a Greek translation. But in Qumran, we know what the word for God was, and the Septuagint is a Greek word for God. Again, I'm not sure you can really tell the difference between Elohim and Yud-Heh-Vav right there.
We also say we fall in love, but that's sort of an English idiom. You'd have to do a word search in Tanakh and see if nafal is generally a negative term.
Yeah. Okay. So
only a negative term.
Right. Only negative.
Yeah. Or even if it was mostly, might make the point well enough. So I just want to go on with the Gemara, and then I want to get to sort of the tie-in with Amalek that we started with. So the Gemara then continues, says, "B'ma'arava mitartzi lahachi." In the West, meaning in Eretz Yisrael, they would read the verse a little differently. When it says, "She has fallen, she will not again arise, O Virgin of Israel," you could read that a little differently. You could read it if you put the comma in a different place. Nafla, she has fallen. Velo tosif limpol od, and she will no longer fall ever again. So you can read the same words. Nafla lotosif. She has fallen, but it won't happen again. Kum betulat Israel. Rise, O daughter of Israel. So we can take the same verse, and if you put a comma in a different place, then it has a more positive connotation. And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said that even though the letter Nun is missing, it's actually there. When the David Amalek wrote this particular psalm, he did put it there, but it's encrypted, it's encoded. Shenemar Samech Hashem L'chol HaNoflim. So I want to show you something. We'll go back up to the psalm here, and the Nun is missing, but in the Hebrew alphabet, the next letter after Nun is Samech. So what does it say there? Somech Hashem L'chol HaNoflim, that God supports all those who fell. Noflim. God supports all the fallen.
Yeah, but if you wanted to talk about the letter Nun, you could have taken the word Nes, for example, which is a positive type of thing.
Yeah, so that's actually why I wanted to give that linguistic point, because it's true there are other words in Hebrew that have the letter Nun in them, but there's something intrinsic about Nun which evokes falling, and that's evidenced by the fact that it falls out when you conjugate verbs that have a Nun in the first position of the root. It behaves in a very peculiar way of falling out more than any other weak letter in the Hebrew consonant in the Hebrew alphabet. So it's you can't whitewash it, right? Even if you choose a different word, there's something built into the letter Nun which is evocative of falling. So the Gemara points out that in fact the notion of falling is cryptically alluded to in the very next verse, but in a positive way, that Hashem will support those who are fallen. And actually, that's what in Eretz Yisrael, when they would recite that verse, that the virgin of Israel will not again fall, right? That's how when they would put the comma in a different place than it's normally read, that would evoke this idea of that next verse in the in the 145th Psalm. Fine. Now, we don't have too much time left, and I want to show you something interesting here. Rav Rimon, some of you may know him. He's a Rav in Alon Shvut. He's an incredible. I actually think there are 5 of him because he's the Rosh Yeshiva of the Lev, Jerusalem. What's it called? The Machon Lev, right? So he runs that program. He's also a Rav in Alon Shvut. He also teaches in the yeshiva. He has these chesed organizations. He publishes books every year. It's unbelievable. It's a really interesting point to make here. He wants to say that when the Gemara says that the Nun is evocative of falling and therefore it's left off, but it's alluded to in the next verse, but in a positive sense, it's not just a drasha. What he says here, Gam al pi pshuto shel mikra. Even if you look at the simple meaning of the verses, not drashas. Mechazek otanu Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak bekach sheberuach hakodesh chazar David. He says when the Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says that the next verse, Somech Hashem l'chol noflim, that Hashem supports those who have fallen, it's meaningful. You'll see. Im kach ha'ot nun mofia b'mizmor. The nun does appear, right? That's Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said it. Right? The next verse. Ulam biyachad im havtachat hakima. But there's in a context of rising. Hashem supports those who have fallen. Havtachat hasmicha somech lenoflim. Okay, now here's his point. Hashem mekim et am Yisrael. God lifts up the nation of Israel. Lo rak biglal shehem amo, not just because we're God's nation, elam misiba nosefet, but for another reason. Pigia ba'am Yisrael, this is a very big yesod here. Any injury to the Jewish people, pogat b'malchut Hashem, it's an injury to the sovereignty of God. When the Jewish people are in a state of suffering, of being vanquished, being defeated, in a fallen state, God's sovereignty is injured. Ein hakisei shalem. God's throne is not complete when the Jewish people's fortunes are in fact injured. The throne is not complete. Now, when Rav Rimon says Ein hakisei shalem, that's this week's parsha, yesterday's parsha, right? That God swore on his throne, case, not kisei. Why? Because God's malchut, his sovereignty, will not be complete until the enemies of the Jewish people are eradicated. And then Rashi brought that proof text that only when Amalek is vanquished does God's case become kisei. When there is an injury to the nation of Israel, the nation of God, then it's case, not kisei. Lachen chasera haot nun dafka acharei haot mem. That's why the letter nun is missing, because the letter nun comes after the letter mem. Now, why is that significant? Miad lachar haskrat malchut Hashem ba'olam. If you look at the previous verse in Ashrai, let's do that. So before the nun, or where the nun should have been, let's read what it says there. Malchutecha, malchut kol olamim. Your sovereignty is an eternal sovereignty. Umemshaltecha b'chol dor v'dor, and your rule is throughout all generations. Hashem's malchut, his sovereignty, cannot be complete when the enemies of the Jewish people still are able to impact upon us. God's malchut. Now, after we reference God's sovereignty, we don't want to mention the nun. Why? Because that nun represents the injury to divine sovereignty. So when we are hoping and yearning for the complete expression of divine sovereignty, we leave out the nun, because the nun represents the injury to God's sovereignty. The nun would represent case, not kisei, the defect in God's throne, in his malchut. So therefore, after saying malchutcha malchut kolamim, your sovereignty is forever and your rule is for each generation, we leave out the nun, because the nun represents the ability of Amalek to injure the Jewish people, which then is an injury to God's malchut. And then we say, but Samech Hashem l'chol hanoflim, but we trust that ultimately God will support the fallen Jewish people, cause us to rise again. Let's go back to Rav Rimon's final summary of his beautiful point he makes here. So he says, Lachen chasareya ot nun dafka chareya ot mem. That's why the nun is missing after the letter mem. Miyad lachar haskrat malchut Hashem ba'olam. Immediately after the mention of God's sovereignty in the world, lemor, to tell us the following: malchut pikuma v'chaserat k'sha'am Yisrael nofel. That God's sovereignty is injured and defective as long as the Jewish people has fallen. And that's the message that we saw in the very end of the Torah reading from yesterday, that ultimately the Jewish people's presence in the world represents God's reputation, God's ability to impose his sovereignty upon the world. The job of the Jewish people is to be those who teach the message of divine sovereignty, and the fate of the Jewish people represents either a positive or negative reflection upon God's sovereignty. And this is Rav Rimod's very interesting attempt at understanding why the letter Nun is missing, because Nun could be used for other words as well. Oh, it has to do with the fact that the letter before it is Mem, specifically Malchutecha, representing God's Malchut, and God's Malchut is never complete unless the Jewish people are in a state of completeness as well. And with that, we will end for today. We'll continue next week, though, with this. I hope to have it ready, the attempt at grappling with the four most difficult psukim in the entire Torah. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.